Well, perhaps I'll start with that. Shots with Watts this week. I'm holding on to that. That's a great idea.
Hey, sure.
I'll admit it's a little too obvious. Pints with Aquinas works because it's assonant.
Sing-songy, but
well, it's assonant. It's not a direct rhyme.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know what else we could do. What other unit of measure?
I don't know.
Kegs with Camus.
Kegs with Camus.
I'm having a junior mint because I'm refined.
What?
I don't know. I saw them on the end cap and I was like, I could go for some of those.
Yeah.
I'm not usually in the mood for them.
Junior mints to me are like the breath mint of candy.
Well, got any other great observations, Copernicus?
I'm just saying, there's not really a lot of.
Well, I mean, mint is always
just
going to
like
be a
sucking
bit
on
specific.
Yeah, but I mean, there's certain.
That's why I said I was in the mood. I'm not.
There's certain
in the mood.
mints that can do it better. Like, for instance, Andes.
I will say this has a smell.
Andes mints.
This has it has a very root beer-ish smell. This is like, I feel like you could have got this at a soda fountain type. See, the sad thing is now the word soda fountain has lost all of its
actual
specialness because it's like, soda fountain. I'm talking like the old school soda fountain. It tastes like Barks, which is my current favorite root beer.
Is it?
Yeah, because it's got this kind of sweet, old-fashioned kind of... I'm not a fan of a lot of other root beers. I think, is there a maltiness in root beer, or is that just me making stuff up?
No, sometimes there is. I have a feeling, or I have a preference.
Let's have a look. What is
I have a preference over the root beers that have a little bit more vanilla forward.
Root beer extract. Ethyl alcohol. Ethyl alcohol? What? Did we accidentally buy fermented root beer?
No.
It has no percentage. Ethyl alcohol, though. Sodium, sparkling foam water. It says yucca extract a lot. That is a plant of some variety. Doesn't mention anything to do with maltedness. I don't know.
Speaking of malt, do you like what are they called? Whoppers? Those malted milk duds? I hate those. I don't know why.
They're not malted in any way that matters, though.
Yeah.
They're like wafers in spherical form, and I don't mind them.
Yeah, but
again, they're
so
the kind of thing I'm like.
And
yeah, they do kind of hurt to chew on.
It's a bit of one of those things where you go, the taste isn't horrid, but the experience is awful.
I wouldn't say awful, but it's one of those things where it's like, if I'm not in the mood for it, I'm not in the mood. This is nothing to write home about. I mean, it's not something to spill, though. I need to have a ready...
I don't have... I'm
going to have to just use one of my things. That's fine.
I'm going to quickly grab my notes.
Oh, okay, so you got notes.
Well, I mean...
He's leaving me alone, everybody, and that's now. He can blame him for what's about to follow. We're doing something unusual. We're very laid back because there's no game present. You won't notice that because there'll probably be a game in post, but it's kind of odd not having the game on. It feels a little bit more...
I actually enjoy it. I truthfully, I think our niche is becoming more and more podcasty. And
well, see, you say that, and we've had some luck with good topics in the past weeks, but I have also experienced sometimes when even the game can't save us.
Well, I mean...
So the problem is, it puts a bit of pressure on us to be like, unless we've got something good to talk about, it's just going to be a bunch of rambling.
I do feel like it's a bit of a catch-22, because when the game's on, discussion digresses very quickly.
Yeah, but always, though, because sometimes the game provides all of the humor. I'm thinking specifically of that lawn mowing game. That was a good time. And it was all because of the game.
I mean,
we didn't talk about anything worthwhile.
True, but it's only because the game was a little bit of it took us by surprise. It was an anomaly within itself.
Not really, though, because
it was.
Because we were in rare form that day.
Yeah, but
because the game wasn't funny in and of itself.
I know,
the game
we went into it, and it was like we did not expect this game to go this hard.
Well, exactly, but then that brought humor, and then we made it
got
funny.
hard, and I'm just playing it.
Why you no?
I
think we'll have a healthy digest, at least to see how that goes. Because this is a modification of what we did last time. Not that any of this matters, because none of you will know, but
it'll all feel the same.
Last time we had the video playing, because I did pre-record the first half, and then we talked for way longer. So then I just went back and played more of the game in order to fill the time out. And I think, especially now that we don't even have the game up at all, because we sort of tried to acknowledge the video last time, and it didn't matter. And then, so there's an element of like...
To that developer, I do apologize, because I actually
don't. And playing the rest of the game, I was like, nah, this kind of sucks. There were some like puzzles.
He doesn't deserve the apology we gave.
There were some puzzles later on, and I was like, I had to get a walkthrough out, because I was like, well, how was I supposed to know I was supposed to do that? Yeah,
but I mean, wouldn't any game feel that way the first playthrough? I mean, like before,
there are games,
like
puzzles.
Ocarina of Time.
No,
as far as
I was like 7, so of course I needed a walkthrough. But other Zelda games that I have played as a conscious and relatively adept gamer, like if I have to get a walkthrough out, I feel like I'm enough. I'm an experienced enough gamer that's more of an indication that the game has failed. If I need a walkthrough.
Huh, that's an interesting...
Maybe you could argue that I'm being weirdly arrogant and like, certainly it can't be my fault.
No, I'm not even saying that. I just think it's an interesting perspective, because it's... and we've talked about this before.
You want a puzzle to be such that you struggle and then get it.
There's a point in which you
don't want to struggle so much that you give up.
To the point of, okay, I enjoy this because it's set up well, even if it is more simplistic, or something that becomes so difficult that you go, well, I'm frustrated now, and not even on a rage quit level, but you just go, I'm actually sick of this.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I got, and that's when I was like, okay, I'm just going to get the walkthrough out, because I need to fill out the time. There was like half an hour of the conversation left. I wasn't just going to sit doing nothing, but I don't know. So this, I think what we've always said we would do, and then we never did, was we would do like the weekend videos would be about the discussions, and then the midweek videos would be about like random indie games. And then we never really did that, because I'm poor. And I don't have just an infinite supply of indie games. Well, but I've got a fair few now. So we could do like the sit and chat kind of thing.
I do think that...
And we'll probably, I don't know, let's review random
so you're saying
custom brewed sodas.
You're moving away almost exclusively from the notion of playthroughs as far as Deus Ex and future...
Well, Batman was a fun experience. I admit Deus Ex, I was like... The game didn't get to...
shine.
The game didn't look as good as I remember it being, and I was like, I do like this game.
Do you feel that that's partly attributed to the fact that
simplified looking at I can actually look at it now and not have it be in the background.
To the notion that you were younger when you played it and you had...
No, I still like Deus Ex. I played through it multiple times. I've played through it as many times as I played through Batman, and I still think I would like them the same. I think it's just Batman being a action-y, it's all about the action. It's not a story heavy, whereas Deus Ex tries to get very philosophical, and if you're not going to engage it, it's just going to really sail straight over you.
I
don't think you got the experience that you should have had from it. Because the experience I had playing it, and I've played it several times, is positive.
The problem is, I think going into it, I probably had a poorer chance at enjoying it quite as much as you did, because the stylistically and even in kind with the type of game it was, I'm not a huge fan of, not even like the first person shooter. That part I enjoy, but it's more the kind of, I don't even know what to call this genre. I suppose adventure shooter is maybe a way of...
No, it's
not. It's a bit of a, hey, we're going to go through this, like almost like an old school James Bond-ish 007 vibe, where you're going, we're playing through
but I love
levels.
those games too. I love GoldenEye. That's a classic.
It's a classic. I'm not going to deny that.
And I really like the missions. I like how the harder the mission it was, there were more objectives you had to do. Like, on the lowest levels, it was just get to the end, but on the higher levels, you had to do all the side quests. I thought that was... I still like that game.
But I think those games held special place in my heart because there was also a degree of...
This is the kind of thing that if you drank...
zaniness to it, I suppose, where it's like, okay, you could also not be playing through it super... You could still get a good enjoyment out of it without having to engage all of the dialogue.
Well, because it wasn't...
Well, yeah,
it was not at all philosophical.
Well,
again,
but
Deus Ex
was.
does get much of a... Well, yeah, and I don't mind that in a game. I think it's just the kind of thing you do have to meet it on its level, and if you don't, you're going to have the experience is totally not going to work.
Well, that's true.
So perhaps it's more of an issue of...
I heard maybe all of 5%.
Yeah. Well, exactly. So perhaps... And then I think, there's indie games to try and there's other stuff. So perhaps we'll just finally do what we said we were going to do. But again, that puts the pressure on us to have something worth talking about every week. So you got something? I do have something.
I actually do want to... I mean, do you want to talk about soda for a second, or you want...
We can, as an interlude, I suppose.
Because I know last week we were a little bit more... heady, I suppose, in regards to the particular.
Well, mine's going to be kind of heavy again.
Well, and I don't have a problem with that.
I mean,
in fact,
you asked for it now.
No, I think that's great. I, in fact, enjoyed last week because it was definitely within my field of study in a far more precise manner.
Well, I don't know if I can help you there this week.
No, that's fine. I was going to actually furnish you with a topic that is a little more mid-range, so it's not quite faffy, but it's not quite as heady as maybe you were planning on going.
It has soda involved?
No. I mean, soda is...
You said something about soda was a catalyst.
I'm just saying we could start there, but I was actually going to discuss the Man in the Cave from Lovecraft. That one that I had read. It's a short story. Because I've started with more of the short stories, whereas you've read more.
I've not read hardly any of the short stories. I read all the long stuff first.
Right. And I thought maybe I would share a bit about that, but I also don't want to just like, hey, here's what happens in that book.
Did you not bring it up before, though? Or did you bring up a different short story? I thought I brought it up
without being live. I think you and I talked about it in a different...
I have no clue anymore because... Yeah, but see, when do you think we've ever spoken without being on this? Wow. We hardly get the chance.
Well, that's maybe getting the chance is a better... Yeah, that's true.
Well, I suppose let's start by saying that St. Arnold, the root beer, is kind of all right. Nothing special.
Yeah, that's a really good way of describing it. It's kind of all right.
I admit, I was intrigued by the packaging. Was pretty... they succeeded at the marketing. And, I mean, I'm not disappointed exactly, but I'm not like, ooh, found a new thing.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about St. Arnold. They say he's the patron saint of brewers, which probably is true, because there's patron saints for all sorts of things, but I don't know. Perhaps, I don't know, we could do a soda review for part of these. The first 10 minutes of every philosophical discussion is, here's what soda that we're drinking.
That's,
Sad thing is, I don't live near Rocket Fizz anymore.
Well, that's, Rocket Fizz.
I used to do that. Literally, that was like, I did that for months. I would go every weekend and be like, I'm going to try it. Because they had the weirdest, crappiest... Some stuff was like, corn-flavored soda. I was like, this is going to be bad. Didn't stop me, though.
What, is there any equivalence? I mean, because I know some people don't have Rocket Fizz.
Rocket Fizz is around. I'm sure there's probably local soda shops. I mean, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, Rocket Fizz is unique because I feel like case in point. So, and you may get into this, but I went through a bit of a quest, I suppose you could call it, to find the best micro brand that was a cream soda. And because I really enjoy cream soda, and obviously went through many different, bottles and things of that nature, but found a local brand back when I was living in the Northwest area that
was called Bedford's, and which obviously you have had with me.
And I didn't. It was good.
You're not
better.
quite as big a fan of it. I still think that, to me, it's my favorite thing. But what I found unique is that when I got to here to Texas, that when you went to Rocket Fizz, they still had Bedford's because they have all sorts of stuff. Kind of a conglomerate of a lot of various places.
Custom small batch soda thing they had. They had some of the weirdest stuff. But they had some good stuff too. Like they had,
they had Bedford's, but I mean they had some good stuff too.
Well, because they had things that I actually liked. They had essentially like a knockoff Dr. Pepper, and it was called.
Oh, I remember that one.
Something similar.
Good.
It almost tasted like if you tried to make Dr. Pepper at home. Like it tasted very
vintage.
Natural.
Yeah,
very
it almost
vintage.
felt like
they had a similar.
Dr.
They
Pepper
had one that was called. Darn it, I keep forgetting all these names. They had a similar thing, but it was like a vintage kind of Sprite. It was almost like if you took actual lemon lime juice and carbonated it.
Yeah, that one I don't remember.
I forget all the names of these.
What's the one Doc Martens? I was joking.
Doc Brown's is a cream soda I also like.
Really liked. Isn't that the one with the weird funny hat? The gent on there with the funny hat?
No, I don't think there was any person on it. It's been forever since I've been.
Are you sure about that?
Not in the slightest, because again, it's been like 2 years since I've been there.
Anyway.
Perhaps we shouldn't do this every time, because then we'll get sidetracked and we'll never talk about anything more meaningful.
I mean, I feel like the
best.
No, I feel like what do you feel like makes a good micro brand soda?
I don't care. It has to taste good.
Well,
I don't care about like how small or how unique or what their story is. It's like, no, if it's not good, I'm not interested.
Sure.
I'll admit, yeah, this is the kind of thing, as far as root beers goes, they can sometimes be a little too sweet. So it's like drinking one is kind of nice, but if you drank more than one, you'd probably be like, too much sugar. This kind of has that, where now that I'm getting to the bottom of the bottle, I'm like, I probably couldn't have more than one of these at once. They're a little cloying for me. I don't know.
Well, I actually made that comment when I was going through my, kind of my search of the best cream soda, because I find that most of them come off to be a little bit more syrupy, which is not my favorite thing at all. The thing I loved about Bedford's was that almost is a little bit... bitter is not the right word. It's got a bit of a bite to it that's less like sweet, and then the sweetness kind of comes on the back end after a bit of the... And I enjoy that vibe.
I'll tell you what this tastes like is like those root beer candies.
Yes. Oh, that
this tastes more like that than any other root beer. And honestly, I'm not a big fan of those root beer candies in comparison.
And I am. I actually like this.
I'd rather... No, it's not bad. It does... I mean, it's... I just don't think I'd have more than one of them at a time, because the sweetness would start to add up.
As far as root beer goes, it's not
my favorite anyways, yeah.
But, anyway, no, as far as the
how many of the Lovecrafts have you actually read? That tells me all I need to know.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a lot. It's probably... Yeah, it's...
I've read a little, but not a lot.
I'm still just kind of dipping my toe into that field. I do find that his writing is immediately compelling, but that's not something that's that profound. I mean, he pulls you in a sense that is not... I enjoy stories that don't... I don't realize that I'm drawn into the story until it's too late. Which sounds very...
See, you have very weird opinions about some of these kinds of things.
What do you mean? I mean...
When you say certain things that are odd to me, where, like you mentioned the other week, where it's like... I forget, it was again another Peaky Blinders thing, where you said something, I was just like, I don't get that. Because again, it's a similar also with Tolkien, where you're like, I like when he goes off on the page talking about nothing that's related to the story, and I'm like... That's weird, but okay. I can't fault that, but it is strange to me. Like, what does that mean? I like not knowing I like something until I go, oh, I like it.
No, what I mean is that if the process
of drawing me in is obvious, if that makes sense. If they're following,
but see, that's
if they're following mechanics,
it crux on the same. This is all the we're getting down to the crux of it all, which is that you like weirdly you don't like being told stories. It seems you're like you almost have to fool me into like now you've got me. Darn it!
What?
You're like, why would you say it's like I don't want to know that they're drawing me in. I'd like to be surprised by how much they draw me.
No,
in.
what I guess
like,
here I'll clarify it.
But you're reading a story, so clearly, objectively, you're asking to be drawn in.
Sure, but
you're just being coy.
I suppose I am a coy reader. I will use this anecdote.
I'm a brazen reader.
As far as
crack open a book, take me.
Take me. I'm just not that way. You got to take me to dinner first. No, I enjoy books that start in the action. I've said that before.
But
where
see,
it's
that's
like,
not terribly subtle.
It's not subtle, but the thing about
you just want the action to be totally unrelated to the story. Don't lie. You would rather a book start in the action with the action having nothing to do with the plot. Because if it did have something to do with the plot, then you'd be like, they're trying to get me.
No, it's not that. I just feel like when you can and I think it's a pacing thing for me, really, is what it comes down to. If you can, and I've said this before, within the first couple chapters of a book, if you can grab me in a manner that's like, okay, I'm interested in not only because so many,
but they can't grab you too hard.
So many, hold on loosely. So many books and authors will try to so heavily to develop the characters that they forget to almost develop the motivation or even the story at large.
That would be the characters.
Yeah, it's partially
the
characters.
Without characters.
Sure, but I mean, you can't. The characters, by necessity, have to be placed within a narrative the minute that the story begins. And so you go, I don't do well with small talk in books, I suppose. The idea of like, this is a guy who's going about his mundane life, and here's another guy who's,
But see, I disagree, because I think if they were well-written characters, you would love going on like, this is his shopping list for the week, and this is where he's going. And it's not at all related to the plot. Tolkien does this a lot.
Sure.
So don't act like this wouldn't work. You just apparently...
It's a difficult thing to explain because again, I think
it's difficult to understand.
It purely comes down to pacing.
This was what throws me off, because I was going to say you probably would like Dickens a lot. Because Dickens is very wordy. And I mean, I'm not saying anything new, but I've now experienced it for more the first time. Because Christmas Carol...
I'm certainly not laconic,
which is the first
I would say that. I mean, I'm not...
Because Christmas Carol is very brief compared to most of his other writing, so I was like, I like this. And now I'm reading A Tale of Two Cities, and I'm like,
that one's a bit... I don't think that I even actually ever finished that one, because it was like, okay,
this is what I don't get, because I was going to say, you'd probably love this, because it's like Tolkien took meth. Now he'll never get back to the point.
I didn't hate it. I mean, I'm just saying...
I'll say he does dialogue well. Dialogue, I'm like, okay, I feel like I understand these characters. It's just when there's no dialogue and he's like, I'm going to talk in abstract metaphors about the way the sun shines through the window, and I'm like, just get to the point. Bring the characters back. Have someone say something.
Please. He's getting away from me, Bezek. No, I think in the case of like The Man in the Cave, I found that Lovecraft pulls you in a way that puts you into the context of the story as if you're almost alongside of the character.
Arguably, any good story would.
Agreed, but not a lot of authors can really pull that off. And I don't know, I can't put my finger on it, which is why it's difficult to explain what I mean.
Is it the fact that I think almost all of his stuff is written first person? Is that why?
I mean, it could be.
I'm trying to think.
Most of the books that I have enjoyed have been first person, so that's a good point. I mean,
I'm trying to think if there's any of his stuff that is not first person. He tends to do it because they're almost always like framed as journal entries or someone writing it down.
That one's that's one of my favorite writing styles, is because I can almost get myself into a place of either you are the character / you are like alongside the character, or you're reading essentially memoirs of an actual person, which you can write in a manner that comes off as if like this is some sort of pseudo history, and I enjoy that. I just think it's
I don't know.
What is your tendency as far as your propensity
I'm not that picky about stuff, it would seem.
Well, but I mean, you clearly have a type as far as
I don't know
books.
that I do. Let's get to the 5-star audit again. I did this for
I'm
films
not talking
last
about
week.
5-star auditing. I'm talking about the fact
I
that
might
you
as well,
clearly
because
have...
I tried this with films and I didn't come up with anything, so maybe if I try it with books.
All I'm saying is you're a book whore. You don't have a problem with books just taking your virginity.
No, that's actually not entirely true, because again, the bell curve holds true where most things are sort of average for me. So it's not like I have friends who it's like everything they read is 4 stars because nothing's great, nothing's bad, and I'm just like, I can't.
Well, that just means nothing.
Yeah, it's like that means do you seriously think the same of all of these? Because I find that hard to believe.
No, yeah, that's...
But some people are like, well, as long as it entertained me, that's all I asked for. And I'm like, that's not all I'm asking for. My ratings. Let's do this live. I mean, I guess, since there's no game, there's no time limit, so I guess I don't need to be cagey about, like, not wasting time. Might as well
we
waste
can
the
also
time.
see how long we're going, so it's not like that's going to be a difficult task to kind of wrap up into various...
Well, yeah, but I'm saying if we're halfway through this now, if I transition to mine, we'd only have a half of a normal video. So either I have to cut this short. We could just completely detach from any time-based perspectives. We could just be like, we'll publish videos as long as the conversation that was had. So I guess whenever this is done, we could publish like a half-hour video and then bash like a 2-hour long of something else. Anyways, I'm looking at these. Lovecraft's high on the list. Ender's Game's high on the list. See, these are all different so far. I've got fantasy, sci-fi, and... I mean, Lovecraft's kind of fantasy.
There's clearly
but
some sort of through line, though. I mean,
not exactly.
to say
Dracula, the
to
Romantic
say that there's
Manifesto
not...
throw things off. Light Between Oceans throws things off.
Well, but I mean, those are different genres. I feel like you can't... Like, I'm different when it comes to reading, like, an actual informational
These are all
book.
over the shop.
I'm just saying informational books / like philosophical books. I'm a little bit more like actually give me the brass tacks of things. I'm a little less.
I still got I've got philosophy books, sci-fi books.
I'm a bit less
History
shy
books,
when it comes to that kind of a
politics, mythology. It's
book.
all
Like
over the
those
place.
types of books. I'm like, okay, see, I want to actually just know what you're wanting to say and have you come out and say it. And
I guess if I were to take if we're sticking with the Lovecraft comparison, my favorite, which is probably a bit unusual, is the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadith, which is very different from his other stuff, because it's very fairy tale ish.
in an almost fantasy way, or
You mean obviously, because all of his stuff is fantastical to some extent,
Sure,
but
but
it's
I mean-
especially weird because the whole point of it is it's technically there was a whole like chunk of his writings that are all exclusively. In fact, they've been published separately, called the Dream Cycle, which is basically there are books of his that take place, quote unquote, in the real world. And then there's books that all take place in what he calls the dream world, or the dream something or other, which is literally like a subconscious dimension that can only be accessed by dreaming. And so all the stories are really weird. So even within his stuff, it's like really weird, and and they feel like dreams in this fact that it's like stuff just kind of happens in ways that things happen in dreams that you don't think about but don't make sense.
It's interesting because within his kind of grander narrative context, it's almost a bit of an interpolation to say, hey, this is something that's happening or that can happen, but it's...
Well, because dreams sometimes it's just like, yeah, that happened, and I didn't question it.
Right,
and then you wake up and you're like, what was that about?
It gives him some freedom. It reminds me a bit of the Brothers Kazamana, where the Grand Inquisitor is inserted in that. You know what I mean? It's the Grand.
It's not a dream.
No, but I'm just saying it allows for there to be a bit of a story within a story, kind of a context. You know. But
I don't think you've read the thing I'm talking about, because I don't know whether you're drawing that connection between them.
Oh, well.
It almost feels like a dream journal.
But
where it's literally like, this happened, and then suddenly I was on the other side of the continent, and I was doing this.
Right. I'm not saying
in a dream you don't question those kinds of gaps.
I'm saying, so take Lovecraft's larger context of his writings. I'm saying clearly he's developed this kind of, okay, well, there's also this dream
it's its whole thing.
dimension that allows him to write more freely in a manner that's a little bit more outside
Another one
of the box.
his that was a similar, as part of that same cycle, is Beyond the Gate of the Silver Key, which has, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating descriptions of fourth dimensional space. That
in an actual
in
like
any
theory
kind of sci-fi
kind of manner, or
because essentially the main character of most of the dream cycle books is a man named Randolph Carter, who's like sort of the ultimate dreamer in the sense that like the things he's able to do in the dreams are unnatural even for other people who can access the dream dimension. And so literally at one point he essentially via his dreams goes back to his childhood and manages to, because there's a short story called The Silver Key, which is basically like this magic key that happens to unlock this sort of the gateway to the next dimension. And so Beyond the Gates of the Silver Key is when he goes beyond the gate into the fourth dimensional space, and essentially describes how most people recognize the fourth dimension as time, and so he says, imagine the way in which if you were to take, say, a cone shape, and you were to cut it with a plane. We're talking geometrically speaking. It's like, if you put it at the bottom, it's a circle. As you move up, the circle gets smaller because the cone is coming to a point.
Sure.
So we, in the three-dimensional thing, we think of those as like, oh, the circle is getting smaller, but it's still part of one shape. And so he describes it as like going from being on the plane to being in the shape. And it made you think, like, if you were to imagine every position your body is in across your lifetime, and like all of that is you, like you're sitting in this chair right now, but you get up and walk to the door, your perception is the plane moving, so you see yourself in different positions. But if you were to view yourself from the fourth dimension, you would be like this weird amorphous shape that goes in all the places you go. And he's essentially,
at that point,
he gains the access to like
lens.
it's like he can essentially then not exactly travel through time, because the argument is his body was in that place, but he can move through all of the various iterations of the places he's been.
Well, it's a bit of a perception determines reality concept, but it's
a little bit. But I just thought it was one of the most fascinating ways of depicting it in a way that made so much sense, but was still very strange to imagine if you could actually perceive in that way. So, I don't know. I guess maybe some of the stuff I like of his is the weirdest stuff.
Do you find, because I know just on a general level you enjoy kind of out-of-the-box thought experiment, things like that.
Well, there you go. Now you're trying to get us back to our discussion.
No, not specifically, but I'm saying the notion that I believe that even I suppose I'll qualify by saying within a given genre, there is going to be a through line on the things that you like or don't like. So, like, take something like, okay, within the genre of, fantasy, or within the genre of, sci-fi or whatever it is. So you have to actually stay within a genre. I'm not suggesting that, like, oh, your sci-fi likes are going to be very similar to your philosophical, enjoyments. Because even that's different for me as far as, again, how I read informational material versus more, narrative kind of material. But I think within the context of a given subgenre, there's going to be a through line of, this is the kinds of things I like. And for me, that is very much almost exclusively, pacing is like paramount for me. The pacing of a book is less so than a movie even. Like, I'm okay with a slow movie, but for me, a book being slow...
You have never indicated that before. So.
Well, maybe I'm mistaken. I mean, I feel like
perhaps you've grown.
Maybe.
You need to watch Locke again.
You just really hung up about the fact that I don't... It's that I feel like with a book, I want to be drawn in quickly. I want to be gripped.
But not forcefully.
Maybe. I mean, it's...
You gotta get me quick, but you can't be hard about it.
It's a bit of...
Seduce me!
It's a bit of the... That's why I like short story. Is because it's concise.
I actually dislike short story for the same reason, because I'm like, if I'm gonna... A book is a naturally slow thing. Like, a movie's over in 2 hours. A book, it's like, I'm committing to this for probably several days. So I'm like, you better make it worth that. Short stories, I find, even when I read through the Dream Cycle, I was kind of like, I was always annoyed. I was like, this could have gone much further. You could have developed this, and I would rather you give me the full thing.
But see, I enjoy that, because then that kind of, those notions and those thoughts stick with you, and then you can almost create your own narrative.
Yeah, but see, that's what's weird. I don't get that aspect of it. It's like, I want to be told a story, but I don't want you to tell it.
What does that mean?
You're essentially
I want my
saying,
own subconscious to tell me a
essentially,
story.
you're basically saying, I just want you to give me a daydream scenario, and then I'll fill it in. It's like, okay, well, you can just daydream then. I'm looking at this because I want them to tell me the story.
I suppose I would compare it to, like, there are times that you want a book to simmer a bit like a long... How do I...
I think you
there
should
are
just
times
say,
you...
I'm fickle.
No, because I'm not. I think that there is a consistency to the fact that pacing is
but
important.
like what? Because your concept of good pacing is still sometimes strange to me.
I still submit that within the first 2 chapters, if you don't have me, you probably lost me.
Yeah, but see, then you say something like that, and then you say, I don't want them to draw me in, obviously.
See, obvious
like, okay, how
and
do you...
quickly is not the same thing.
Okay, no, but because what you said, I mean, you couldn't... There's 2 ways of interpreting what you said, and knowing you, I'm going to think you're talking about the complicated way. Because you're not, obviously...
Well, thank you very much.
I understand that you could view it as like, I don't want it to just be obvious tropes that you try to use. I don't think that's what you meant, because you...
What I mean is...
What I think you mean is, I don't want to feel like the author is trying to... Because you said this about Arcane even, where you're like, sometimes it feels like it's trying too hard to get my emotions. And I'm like, that's I don't get why that would bother you. Unless it was disingenuous. I can understand if you're someone, I feel like they twisted the story in order to make this happen in a way that was unnatural.
The best stories to me don't break the plane of narrative of author to
but see, this would be the same way as saying, like, well, if I noticed that the cinematography in this one movie was really good, then the movie must not be good because I was noticing the cinematography. And I'm like, that's not
a fair argument.
No, I mean, okay, a fair argument of what I'm saying, but I think that's not.
I'm saying your point is well made.
I mean, I guess it depends, because I would say that if you are someone who likes the art of filmmaking, since that's the example, I don't think it's a problem. Like, to say it's and then especially that makes it even almost impossible upon the film director to say, I am someone who likes studying films, so you really better make me forget that I'm watching a film. It's like, well, that's an impossible task, because the better the film is, the more you're going to notice
I suppose
that you like it.
I would submit that it is the former, but it's not quite as obvious as tropes as much as it is if you're using... Again, it's an obvious literary technique. If it's like there are certain methodologies
but see,
for
Arcane does not fall into any tropes that I can really think of, unless you're talking the broadest archetypes, which I don't think is fair.
Saying is you're really just trying to defend Arcane, and you're really hung up about that.
Well, no, because we didn't. I mean, I sort of touched on this, but we didn't get into it. Was your notion about, like, you liked Peaky Blinders because you said it was more nuanced than Arcane? I'm like, but I would say Arcane is more profound because of the fact that it's just archetypes on archetypes. Like, it is essentially and that's not to say that it doesn't have individual... This is the difficulty with archetypes, because as I said in the last one, an archetype is a story concept without nuance. I admit that. Like, you could just make a story where it's like the mentor character said this to the hero character. It's like, obviously that would be very boring because there wouldn't be any people.
But see, that's the kind of thing that I'm really sensitive to in a book. It's if it feels that way to me, and the characters feel very two-dimensional. But I think the more you distance yourself from an archetype, it loses any of the profound meaning that an archetype can have. And see, that's the tension for me, because I agree with you in that, but because I enjoy Arcane, but I feel like Arcane leaned so heavily into it that they lost a little bit of the...
I don't feel like they... But see, that's the thing, is that none of those... The way they did it is that all of the characters have multiple archetypes at once, which is the way real people are.
That's true.
And that's why I think they managed to create complexity despite remaining true to archetypal frameworks, is the fact that they layered them on top of each other.
Yeah.
Because it's the best. Essentially, it's what I always, the way I have viewed it. This is a bit of a visual thing, I guess, as a way of describing the way it feels. Is it's almost like the way I visualized it. And forgive me if this sounds kind of stream of consciousness, but it's almost like if you're looking down a well that's got a big spider web that goes all the way down. And if you just flick the top of it, you can literally see the whole web all the way down. And that's what I feel like watching something like Arcane is, where it's like every single scrap of decision making was done such that it would tie into everything.
That much I agree.
So it's literally like you touch this one thing because it's curious and you see the whole web shake.
I don't disagree with you in that. Watching Arcane, that's very true.
Is that true. I don't know, do you have vertigo or something? Or is that in some way not? Because that to me is what I want. If a story can do that, where I go, I can literally see every layer that it's all at once.
Oh, for sure. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that my previous statement suggests that.
Well, it seems as though you would rather have the layers. Like, I want to look at one layer at a time and see it, and then I'll look at the next layer at a time, and I'm like, I want to see it all at once. Give me the whole plate of spaghetti.
I want to be able to. Like, if I'm reading a book...
No, this makes sense, because you're one of those weirdos who eats a plate one item at a time.
Well, that's certainly true.
And I'm a person who'll just I want the meal as it is. I want all of it together, because sometimes
you eat
the
potatoes
contrast...
and then
you take a bite of this and take a bite of that. I think we've just discovered something here.
Okay.
I'm more well-rounded.
Or I just take time to enjoy one piece at a time, because I...
Yeah, but sometimes that means that you miss the interconnectedness.
That's certainly true. I suppose what I would say is, especially when reading a book, but I think to a lesser degree, but still true, that watching a show or watching a movie, this is true, that the first time I watch it, I want to, or engage with the book, I want to just be enjoying it. The second time is when I go, wow, there's so many great literary or cinematic cues or, relative principles or whatever else. Like, for instance, me rewatching Peaky Blinders is fascinating how much actually intention goes into various things, as far as even just characters that they include in literally background parts of scenes where you go, I never even knew that they were there, and they were there. And so it's like, it's a bit of those kinds of things enjoy.
But that... all the more for something that is so heavily tied together, because then it's literally like, I mean, I feel like even on rewatching Arcane, it's like that's exactly the same experience, and I would argue more so, because every detail ties in, and I didn't feel that way about Peaky Blinders. Because
you should rewatch it.
I wouldn't be opposed to that, but even then, I'm like, just by the sheer scope of it, there's gonna be fluff. It's twice as long per season for 5 seasons.
Sure.
It's like it by necessity will have to have filler. And that's what I think I like about Arcane, is that like if you took a well-written thing and then cut down everything that didn't add, it's like this is how you get literal diamonds. It's like you compress it so tightly that nothing is wasted.
Yes, they definitely distilled.
But see, I think you seem to not like that level of distillation. You'd rather have, I don't know what you'd call it, a sort of
digression.
Well, not quite to that.
It's digression. It's divergence. It's a bit of the, when I'm reading, I do want something to be diverting. It's like, oh, that was kind of a clever, like, for instance, I'm one of those people that when I read through the Lord of the Rings, some people really get hung up and upset when the character Tom Bombadil, comes into the equation. And
because he serves the plot in no meaningful way.
Agreed.
And I guess that's one of those things where you go, okay, this could have been cut, and it wouldn't have lost anything.
And it's one of those things that has divided fans repeatedly. But some people go, that was a fun diversion, and other people go, get out of here.
Well, but
You know what I mean?
Yeah, but that's... I'm trying to think of what the opposite of what I like is... Because profundity is the word that comes to mind when you're saying everything tying into everything else such that it couldn't... I feel like you like... Well, but see, I was going to... Because I do too. I was going to say you like dissecting things almost, where it's like, I want to look at each individual part.
Yes.
Whereas with something like Arcane, you can't because they're so tied together. And that's kind of what makes it awe-inspiring to me. Is like,
it's good.
So you can't take it apart. And I think that bothers you, is that you would rather be able to get like a microscope and say, I want to focus on this.
That's true.
But I can't because it's tied to that. Whereas I want the whole thing at once.
Yeah.
I want to stare at like the entire big spaghetti ball.
No, yeah, that's true. That is true. I like to pick apart. Well, I mean, that's how I am even with my own personality and dealing with people.
You would
too.
also be the kind of person, to go back to food, it's like you're probably the kind of person it's like, I want to taste only the most subtle notes of this, and I think, oh yes, very, and I'm just like, I want you to smack me in the face with flavor. I want to take a bite of this, and I want to be on my back going, holy crap, I taste everything. This is, I think,
taste all the flavors.
Is that you're like, no, I want it to be very subtle, and I'm just like, this doesn't taste like anything. I want to be punched in the face with flavor.
I think that is true, but there is a part of it that I suppose I resist. I don't like the notion that somehow I am not consistent. I think that is
well,
is
you probably
untrue of
are,
my-
but you're consistent to an internal logic that no one else knows.
That's true.
So I don't know what
That's
you're
true.
consistent about.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think you've hit on the fact that for sure, I do like to dissect things. But interestingly enough,
But see, I take
I want
slight
to be
issue with
able
that,
to-
because like well, maybe
No,
I haven't
I'm not
dissected.
saying-
Maybe dissected isn't the word, because like, I mean, what else? What we've talked for Arcane and Peaky Blinders about for hours, so they must. I mean, does that
right?
qualify?
That qualifies as
or is
dissection.
that just observation? I guess.
No, I mean, I certainly think that dissection is a. But the thing that I find is that I want meaning to be added each time I read something or watch something.
But see,
I don't want all of it to try to hit me in the face all at once.
But see, the thing is, you can't take it in all at once, so it will always reveal new things. Because it's so
that's
dense
true.
That you couldn't take it in all at once.
Well,
but
and
the fact that you can, I like the fact that you can see it all at once. You obviously can't take it in all at once, but
to
then it
Arcane's
means that like
credit, that I think was why. Because I enjoyed Arcane the first time I watched it, but it wasn't quite to the degree that you did. And I think a real big part of that for me was because it was the equivalent of trying to drink through a fire hose. There's so much information, so interconnected that you're going, I can't dissect anything.
Well, but I think,
you know,
I almost wonder I mean, we could get into a very psychologizing. Where
do it. If I might lend a machete to your intellectual
I wonder
thicket.
is there an element of like, I mean, this might sound a little bit, don't take this as an offense, but is it an element of control, or it's like I want to parse?
Yeah, 100%.
Whereas to me, it's like if a world feels real to such an extent that it's like
it's happening
without and I am simply in it, and I'm not, and because that's the way the real world works, is that you can't take in all the details, and yet your brain is perceptive enough that when the details are there but only in the background, it's like, okay, you can't drink from the fire hose, but that implies that there is a lot there.
Sure.
Like there's a lot of volume.
Sure.
Even if I can't access it all at once, I know that it's there, and I appreciate that. Whereas I find the kinds of things you describe don't always have the volume, where it's like, yes, this individual element is nicely and detailed, and there's lots of stuff, but then I can look, I look in the background and think, nothing there.
I'm the Eastern philosopher studying the single bead of dew on the piece of grass.
Well, but see, when you...
it's like, it's equally powerful in a different way.
But I don't know that I agree, because for something like Arcane, or anything that is that level of complex, it's a bit of the diamond net, which is the Taoist, I don't know what you'd call that, thought thing. There's a term for that, and it's escaping me. It's as in, you can, well, I suppose I now have to give the full context of it, because essentially the concept of the diamond net is there's, at every intersection where the lines of the net cross, there is a perfectly crystal gemstone, and they all reflect each other, such that by looking at one, you can see all of them. And I feel like if you were to take the gemstone out, you would only then see it. And as pretty as it might be, I think it's far more fascinating when you can't take it out. So something like Arcane, you could write a whole dissertation about any character from Arcane. And in a way, doing so,
you would have to write about the other.
You would have to write about all of Arcane.
No, yeah, I understand.
And in some ways, I like that it's so cohesive that it rejects being torn apart, because it's like, no, you can't, because in every character are reflections of every other, because they're so tightly tied together.
Sure.
And I feel like when you want to take it out, you might say, well, look, I want to look at this gemstone on its own, but so it's like,
to answer your question. And I don't think I take offense to it at all. I think, yes, there is absolutely a degree of control to it. I don't think that that's untrue of me. I think that the reason I appreciate... It's not even an investigative level. It's like I want to be the one to connect the dots. I don't want someone else to connect them for me and go, look at all these dots and now they connect. It's like,
but see, I don't,
you know what I mean?
But I don't feel like Arcane does that at all.
No, I mean, that's fine. I'm saying,
but in some ways,
within a literary context.
But I almost feel like maybe this could be the part of it, is that I feel like Peaky Blinders is very much the kind of thing you get out what you look for, which I think you might like. Whereas I feel like with Arcane, there's interpretations, but there's definitely something objective there that they are trying to communicate. So it's not like I look into it and I can connect the dots myself, because in some ways I can't. The dots are connected. Yeah. And I want to find how they're connected.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like your notion of I want to be the one to connect them means that they have to let you potentially draw an inference that they didn't intend. And then I feel like when a story is that open-ended, that means, sometimes that level of interpretation is interesting, because then you can have conversations about two people's comparison. But I still personally find I would rather dissect is perhaps, again, we're finding some contention with that word. I would rather explore the various things that have been placed there and find... It's not so much connecting the dots as it is almost like following the trail, where it's like there's definitely a path here.
I want to follow it. This is a good way of describing it.
But I don't want to make it up for myself.
And this is what I will submit, because I think this is the best example and how this is going to explain the way that my brain works the best. In theology, in the study of specifically, biblical theology, there's a couple different kind of ways of approaching Scripture that people use in order to actually understand Scripture. There's biblical theology, which is very textual. Okay, I'm focusing on specifically the original text, the how the text came about, all these other things. There's historical theology, which is primarily focused on how sources came about, but also focused on what parts of history connect external to the Bible as far as other historical context and supporting documents and things of that nature. And then there's systematic theology, which is I'm going to take the theology of the Bible, the biblical theologians and the historical theologians, and basically summate those things into a cohesive, this is a built, systematized thought process across the Scripture, and here's some places where it seems to support this particular theory. I am decidedly, especially having gone through my my graduate level studies, I am decidedly a systematic theologian. I'm a systematizer. I appreciate being able to put things together and say, okay, now they're in a package, and this is actually what this looks like.
But it's your package. You're insisting on it being your package.
No, I mean, it could be a package that I'm contributing to, certainly.
Well, because the way I'm going to take this in a totally different analogy, but in a way that I hope will still elucidate my thoughts is, you're always going to have, even with something that might, because obviously this is the difficulty, is because I'm sure even people would probably disagree with me in saying that like arcane has an objective meaning it's trying to convey, because they might say, well, no, I look at this character and I think this, and we might have disagreements. So I suppose it's not that it's an objective thing. I guess maybe here's what I feel like based on what we're saying is how it sounds is I feel like even when grappling with something external to me, there's always going to be a reflection of me in it. So I feel like I can look at arcane and what we've talked about it plenty is like I see elements of myself within these characters. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that those characters were written with that explicitly, but it's like I'm still going to find that, but I find it best by looking externally. Whereas I almost feel like you would rather someone just like give you the building blocks and then you make something for yourself. Which would also, well, in the sense of you connect the dots in the way that your psychological predispositions are going to.
But that's saying the same thing, right?
But in a sense, I feel like you're being given almost like it's almost more of like looking at a mirror and saying, "Oh, I'm coming to my own understanding," whereas I feel like it's this. I don't know if we had this on. I don't think this discussion was on air. So if I were to use it in this analogy, it would break down because I'd have to explain it again, which I guess I might have to do.
Sure. You might.
We had the concept of self-centeredness and why I think that should be reframed as not as a negative thing, because people I think of it as synonymous with being self-obsessed. Mm-hmm. And I would say, to condense the broad brushstrokes of my point, is to be self-centered is essentially getting yourself out of the way. I used the analogy of a camera. If you did do a 360 panorama, the camera has to stay in one's point, and this camera is the center of the picture, but it's not in the picture. And you want that because then you can see everything else and the camera vanishes. So in a sense, I think being self-centered is the way of getting your ego out of the equation.
And I would submit...
And what I'm saying is there's only one way, or no, there's two ways you could, quote, to use very unhelpful language, like to find yourself or to sort of reflect on yourself. It's like, especially if you take the camera example, you could either just point the camera at a mirror and then you see the camera, or you do the 360 panorama, which you can essentially, it's like the space, it's a negative space thing. It's like you can find the self by what isn't you. You look at the world and then you see I am what is not this. So that's why I'm saying the 360 panorama. It's like you can know as much about the camera as you need to despite not being able to see it. Whereas I feel like you would rather see it in the mirror and then just go, oh, I can analyze it.
And study it.
I can study it like this. Whereas I'd rather see the negative space left by all of the things around it.
Yeah, that's a fair way of
And I feel like
it.
the more connected a thing is, it's essentially I am I don't feel like I'm looking at myself, but I still feel like I am...
Yourself is being expressed through the projection of...
Yes, because it's the way in which this interacts with me that I'm not looking at myself, I'm looking outwards, but still being able to... Again, I guess it's a Zen-ish, nothing outside the self, nothing within kind of concept.
Well, and I would say... and I was actually going to posit that as much as I know your sentiment in saying self-centeredness is considered with very negative connotation, I would argue that that's almost an exclusively Western problem, because Eastern
context and culture would say self-centeredness is actually a positive thing. In that, again, if you say, like for instance, in the Western culture, the best way for me to explain that is to say, remove the word self. People say all the time, oh, that's a very centered person. That's a positive thing.
Yeah.
So why is it that simply by adding the word self, now all of a sudden we have a problem?
Well, and I think it's
like
the issue I take with it is you can't be centered on anything else.
Exactly.
If you're a conscious observer, you can't. You kind of have to be the center, because otherwise you would be appearing externally. Which, if that's happening, again,
you got some problems.
Means that you're projecting yourself into the world again.
Yeah.
And that's an issue. So it's
but see where that analogy breaks down is I don't feel like the mirror is me specifically projecting myself into the external necessarily.
Not projecting, but it's reflecting.
Yes, that part I would agree with. And that in that case, I suppose it would be.
Whereas I want to get out of it.
It would be akin to like using sound waves on a reverberation level and going, okay, so I'm throwing waves out in order to have them reflect back at me and going, okay, that's what that sounds like. You know what I mean?
I guess my whole thing is I want to be out of this equation. I want to observe it, which means I have to be
almost above it.
I guess, or again, 360 level. In the center of it, where it's like I would again, and that's why I like when the world is so fleshed out. And again, it's the kind of thing. It's like you obviously can't take it in all at once, but on a subconscious level, your brain knows that detail's there, which only adds to the richness of the world. Because the fact that I can't focus on it doesn't change the fact that I notice it, and so it makes it feel like it's a little bit of the kind of thing you don't notice until it's not there. You think, oh, that's kind of flat and one-dimensional. Whereas if there's detail everywhere, I almost feel like I go, oh, it almost gives you the ability to sort of dissociate yourself and just go, I don't have to notice it because I don't have to observe all of it, because just knowing that it's there creates the illusion of the grander world. And in some ways, I feel like you could also, go through with a microscope and check everything, but then you'd get, I feel, it's a gestalt, I guess, kind of thing.
It is.
Where it's
well, and to your credit, and I think also,
who'd have thought we'd still be talking about this again? It's been a while since we invoked this particular law of conversation.
What conversation?
As in, we haven't talked about Arcane in a while.
Well, that's true. I think
that's probably not true. I'm sure it's probably like, oh no, it was 2 weeks ago.
That was just last week. No, the downside, I suppose, and what I will acknowledge. This is why I would say it's not disingenuous for me to say that it's not specifically fickle as much as it is. My preference certainly is to use that reflection principle, but I know that that's limited in how I can see myself, so there are times I, by necessity, have to then use that negative space concept, because I would use this analogy by saying, if you're using a microscope to analyze every little detail, you're only going to be able to see through a lens this big.
Yeah.
And then you can't see the bigger picture because you're only looking through a lens this big. It's a little bit like trying to look at a painting that's like, I got to see every little... And
you could eventually construct the whole painting that way by seeing individual inches, but then it's like...
You're missing the sense of the artist's
it's
scope.
It's the forest for the trees kind of thing.
Yeah, no, you're right. And that's, so, I mean, getting back, I suppose, bringing it full circle to the idea that within the man in the cave, one of the things that I got out of it, which was interesting, was there was a point in the story where I actually predicted the story, which normally bothers me really bad, but it actually didn't bother me because it was so my brain was so hungry for a solution at that point that it was like, oh, finally the solution, even though I knew what it was before the story was over.
Well, and that's, I don't think,
it was a little bit like,
we've said before that it's only a problem if it's
unintentional,
very far. Well, no, it's a good twist always happens very close to when the audience figures it out.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about that. Basically, the two best twists are it's either you figure it out like right before it happens, and then you're like, "Oh, I got it!" Like right when it happens,
which is what happens.
Or it happens, and then you go, "Oh, it makes sense now."
Yeah.
It's like the final puzzle piece, where it's like those are the two best kind of twists. And the further it gets from the moment of revelation, where it's like, "Oh, you either predict it way too far in advance, or it's so convoluted that you like after the story's over, you're like, I still don't get how that made sense." That the further the twist is from the audience ability to perceive it, that's the problem. Like, you want those nice and tight together.
Right. I mean, there are times that you are watching something where you're going, "This is so stupid," because
Like I knew where this was going half an hour ago.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I hope that somewhat clarifies my sentiment. I mean, the notion of pacing for me being that I have to.
You are probably if you think about it in the classical, like the personality questions, you are probably a more detail oriented, and I am probably more big picture in terms of like the classic left brain, right brain.
That's probably true. Yeah.
Whereas like I would rather see, but then I mean, and I like.
You definitely pay attention to detail. Yeah, I mean, you're a finite thinker.
Yeah, I don't, but I still think that.
Again,
if you start big picture, then you can always gain higher resolution.
Yeah, and you and I are basically saying it's a starting point, not a demand of the only way in which you think. It's more of like you tend to start wide and then kind of funnel into here's what we're going to focus on, whereas I tend to start small and then go, okay, let's look at out. So it's really just kind of a reverse thought process.
Yeah.
Which is why I think you and I end up complimenting one another, because there's a bit of it's that conspiracy meme of the guy pointing in all directions with the string on the map. Like, it's a bit like the look at how all these things connect, because of course we're then moving back and forth, kind of oscillating between these two concepts of looking big picture and looking detail. But I certainly agree that I tend to start detail and then branch out to big picture, whereas you're like, what's the larger thing?
Because essentially it's like you're starting with sort of what almost is like a diorama, where it's like it's self-contained.
Yeah.
And I tend to not like things that are self-contained. It's like because then it feels small. Even if you just imply, I don't have to see the rest of the picture, but if you imply that it's there, then it's like, okay, now this doesn't feel like this little diorama. It just feels like I'm zoomed in on the big picture again.
What I find curious is on a leadership level, though, I suppose my only supposition would be that by necessity, with vision for the future, you have to be big picture first, almost. And then you have to go back and go, okay.
Well, something must be unified.
Right. I mean, there has to be here's the target, and then we go back and actually detail how we're going to get there, kind of a thing.
Well, and that's why obviously you have to be able to do both. You can't just say, "Oh, I just manage the big picture and not know any details." Then you're a middle manager.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I suppose, like when I'm reading a book, and using the framework of like, the Man in the Cave, it's the details drew me in so quickly that the big picture was more of an excitement to reveal. Whereas if I feel like where I meet, and this is where I say it makes sense in my head as to the kind of balance in this, is that if you give the big picture away so obviously that it's like, and here's the big picture, now let's get back to the details. It's like, no, I don't want that. I don't want to see. Now, again, I like what you said about if you can kind of hint to the fact that there's big picture stuff going on, I enjoy that. But if you just go, here's the full thing and we're trying to lay it out, it feels a little bit like, okay, like narration is my least favorite tool as far as literarily. If it's some sort of like I remember this and I'm gonna basically tell you that story kind of a thing.
That's just telling rather than showing. I mean, that's
right.
You can narrate in a way that isn't obvious.
Agreed.
It might be harder, I suppose.
So anyway, I'm just that is the kind of balance, and I don't know how that through line works for you on an opposite level of tending to look more big picture
Well,
first.
I think if you're talking about the plot, like obviously you can't spell out the whole plot and then have me go back because then I'll know what's going to happen later.
Sure.
But I mean, it's more in the sense of the world because again, we've had conversations where it's like, okay, you can focus on this character and follow them throughout the whole story because it is so detailed that you can do that. But then you can zoom out and then say, oh, now how about this character? It's like you start at the beginning and go, oh, this is so deep that you almost just sort of passively take it in the first time, which is sort of what you were talking about.
Yeah.
But it's doing your best to swallow from the hose at that point, even though you're going to miss some, I guess.
Right.
And then if it is detailed and well realized, then you can zoom in later. And I'd say zooming in is only useful once you've taken it all as best you can at the
Agreed.
first half.
Agreed. Yeah. Which is, again, the flaw in sometimes it's the very reason I would argue why Arcane... I didn't appreciate Arcane until I continued mulling it. Does that make sense?
Well, but I would argue it only gets better because
Agreed.
of that.
But what I'm saying is because I tend to work more the opposite manner, then I'm sitting there going, there's so much to take in that I've got to process through all this information first, almost like the equivalent of a printer trying to scan in a document. And then once it sees it, it goes, oh, this is a document. It's like that's how I felt with Arcane, where I'm going, there's so many. And what's interesting is the thread I think that I kind of tugged on to all of a sudden have that moment of there's a broader narrative here is that moment with
Well, at the end.
well, it's not at the end.
It's the end. You described it as being literally, it was like in the last episode when you were like, oh, okay, I get what they're trying to do. And I was like, well, okay, I got what they were trying to do at the beginning.
No, but what's his name? When
Silco, probably?
No, when Victor has his whole... That was a big deal for me, and I don't know
but
why...
But again, that was a particularized moment.
Was.
You were stuck in that. You were intrigued by the one moment.
But it then all of a sudden drew me into the larger narrative. And here's why. And I'll tell you why. Because what it did was it said, it's the Sonder principle. That's like this is the character that's not even really a main character necessarily.
Him or her?
Victor.
He's a pretty main character.
Not really, though.
He's got about as much screen time as the rest of them.
Sure.
When you actually analyze it, the sisters make up a pretty small proportion of the.
Maybe
you think of them as the emotional, because in a sense, they are the through line of the film, or the show, because it starts with them and it ends with them. But proportionally speaking, they take up about as much screen time as everybody else.
Yeah, I suppose with Victor, it doesn't. He's not written to be a primary character, I suppose.
Well, and he's very much written as not a background character, but as a support character.
Yeah, exactly. So to all of a sudden have him have that much of a arc and context of like, oh, this is going on, and then all of a sudden my vision was forced to go, let's look at the whole thing. And that's when it all of a sudden made sense to me. So I do think that really is, we've hit on something here, which is that you and I just tend to, again, complement one another and we oscillate backwards.
But see, I feel like what you said earlier I think you may have contradicted yourself, is because I feel like I tend to be someone who basically lets it happen the first time. And I think you are someone who wants to actually analyze it the first time, or at least follow it the first time.
I want to analyze the...
Because you acted like, I want it to happen without me noticing, but I'm not sure that... I feel like you want to latch on to something and then follow it. Whereas I want to just have it happen at me, and then I'll latch on to the parts I want details on later. It seems like you go, if you're not going to give me enough detail, I'm not going to be able to maintain focus.
Correct.
Which means you want to focus on one thing throughout.
It's not even one thing, but I think that your previous statement was more correct, which is that if the details don't... If I can't pick up on the little microcosms of story and narrative, and keep moving, I struggle. So if it's so buried, and this is just true.
Arcane does start off with like, here's the 6 threads we're gonna follow,
and if it's so
and they
buried,
only come together later.
That's hard for me, and I will say, because I'm not as much a immediate big picture guy. That is the reason why it's hard for me, is because I get obsessed with the detail.
So you were sitting there going, you got me holding all these threads.
Look at all these threads I can't connect. It's
what am I supposed to do with these?
Well, and once I connected them, it was great. But it's like, so
to me, that's where I was sort of like,
you were trying to go, it connects over here.
Well, I actually got frustrated because I was sitting there with the threads going, I know how these are going to connect. Why aren't they connecting yet? Because, like, we had the whole conversation, but like, it took you until the end of the show to realize that Silco's not a villain.
Yeah, that's true.
Or at least is an anti-villain, sort of. Whereas I was like, episode 3, I'm like, I'm on this guy's team.
But it totally makes sense when you think about how you and I think, which is that you're looking at
because I was like, oh, I see where he's going, and I get it. And then I got frustrated later in the show going like, I know what he's about, just get to the point.
Right, and I
Not
wasn't
to the point, but I was like...
See, for me, they did have to do that kind of... So they do well at catering to both audiences, because they did do a bit of hand-holding for me.
Because I think the issue that you make it would be an issue, and I think you would hate something that is only broad, and then when you zoom in, it's like, oh, there's nothing here.
Well, it's not even there's nothing there. It's just...
or that it's very low resolution.
Again, I come back to the pacing thing. If it's so fast that I cannot grab any details at all, because there's so many, which is what happened with Arcane, that it's like, okay, I can't. I'm sorry. Which is why I enjoy the diverting kind of moments with Tolkien and with, But
see, then the thing that bothers me about those is like, okay, yes, this is nice and detailed, but it's like, here's where we're actually at. What are we doing here?
But it just gives me a moment of breath.
If you say, if we've got the big narrative and then you focus on something in it, it's like, okay, now I'm having details about this. But if you go, we're going to take a diversion to go look over here, it's like, well, this isn't tied in.
Right. It would make sense.
If you can imply that in this small moment, there's hints of the bigger story, it's a little bit like, if you can tell that the jigsaw piece is in the puzzle, then okay, it's worth looking at. But if it's like, if this is from a different puzzle, I'm not interested right now. I want the puzzle.
Yeah. No, and that's true. That is interesting, because I think that opened up even just an interesting thought appreciation for you and I and our differences, because I think that is able to be expounded to larger contexts of our thinking. I mean, just in philosophy and in very many things. It's like, there's the way that we approach life tends to be, well, I mean, even in just the way that we are well read, there's differences in what I tend to read in a manner that's like, I want to read a particular topic on a particular thing, and then I may expand because I follow this thread and that thread.
But see, the interesting thing about that, here's the thing I wonder. You strike me as perhaps you would be the kind of person who's like, I mean, random analogy, but it's like if you're in a bookstore and you're just like, oh, I'm kind of curious about this, and I'll pick this up, and then I'll read it, and then I'll be like, oh, now I want more details about this. Whereas to me, literally, I have whole lists of things. I was like, I'm curious about this subject. I'll research. What should I read about this subject? And then I go to the bookstore going, I'm looking for this miniature library of this whole subject, because I'm starting, again,
that's
from the outside,
right,
and I want to say,
exactly.
okay, now I'm going to get the individual pieces.
Right, whereas I go, I'm going to follow this one thread, and then I go, oh, I need more now.
And that means that, and I sometimes end up struggling where it's like, okay, I don't have these books, so it's like I could just pick up any old book and be like, well, but then I'm like, what if this isn't the best book? What if this is like not that great a book, and then I'll have to read something else later?
See, and
I come into it going, no, I know what the books I need are.
Well, and I almost appreciate the times that you do read a crap book, because then you go, well, that was not. You can use them as I suppose.
But with factual, especially when it comes to like informational stuff, I almost always start with the notion of, I want. What is it's of all things totally? I mean, it'll relate, but it's random. It's the lyric from and this is unusual because it's not my personality type, but it's from the Enneagram 1 song by Sleeping at Last. Because I'm not a 1, but I guess I must have some 1-ish elements, because that song's one of my favorites. And the line he says is, I forget it exactly. It's something like, I want to sing a song worth singing, an anthem worth repeating, where it's like, I go into something going, I don't just want to pick up some random book and it's like, I want it to be the best book. I'm going to research ahead of time. What's the best book on this subject? Well, but see,
I do that. I mean, I don't think that's inherently a one thing as much as it is just...
But I do think that means, like, I'm starting from the bigger picture of the thing. And then I go, this is what I want to learn. What should I start with? Because then I'm, again, starting big, and then I'm zooming in. Rather than, I don't just want to pick up a book and go, oh, now I'm interested in this. And now I have to zoom back out.
So here's a detail, or here's again how I would describe the difference in how we get to basically the same conclusion, but when in different means. When I was looking up, a particular microphone that I was going to buy or whatever else, I literally start by saying, because I'm familiar at least with some degree of sound engineering and things like that, I go, okay, what is the best type of mic? And then I go into research, okay, the dynamic, the condenser, or the...
But that's rather broad.
No, that's fairly specific. But I go, why am I all of a sudden looking at that one detail? It's because I want that detail first, because then I'm going to then say, okay, now that I've decided I want condenser, what is the best condenser mic within this framework or whatever else?
That's zooming in after that. You're starting from a bigger and going in.
Sure. But again, I don't think... I tend to want the details ahead of the... I don't think it's an exclusive thing to somebody who thinks broadly to say that you want to do the research ahead of time. Like that, I certainly do still. But when I go into a bookstore, I certainly am going to grab a book on a topic and go, that's the one I want right now. That's a very detailed, like, pinpoint, precise thing. I don't want multiple books on it because I can't read multiple books at the same time.
Well, not at the same time, but that's where I go. I'm saying I start with, like, okay, give me 5 books that'll encapsulate the subject. And then I'll find those books. You're sort of starting with, it's again a low resolution, big picture, and then you fill in the details smaller, but I know where the details fit once I get them. If you start with the details, then you kind of got to go, well, now I don't know where this goes. I just have this.
I suppose, and again,
and now I have to find another detail, and these two go together. Now I have a slightly bigger picture. Whereas I go, give me a low resolution first starting point, and then I'll zoom in as I need to find the details as I go. Resolution's the right way of putting it. It's like you could have a really low resolution image, but you can still see what's in it most of the time. Unless it's super low. But if you get a reasonably quality, low resolution image, you can still tell what's in it, and then you can zoom in and say, okay, let's I guess I don't know what the term is, but like let's interpolate, let's add the resolution now. Then you can zoom back out, and then the image is still clearer, but you still knew what it was. Rather than going, it's a little bit of the, you solve a puzzle by looking at the picture on the box. At least maybe you don't. You might be the kind of person who goes, no, I'm going to look at every individual puzzle piece, and then I'll go, these two fit together. And then these ones fit. Whereas I go, no, what's the box? Okay, I need these pieces. Let's get a rough shape going.
I build puzzles from the outside in. So I build the border.
Well, but that's... because those are the obviously identifiable ones.
Right, but I'm saying that is the point. That has nothing to do with the picture, but that's what you do, because that sensibly makes the most...
I feel like that's a little bit cheating, though, because the reason you do that is because they're obviously identifiable. If a puzzle company was a little bit devious and there was no clean borders and all
that would suck.
See, I would find that funny though, because that my strategy would still work, because it's still just...
You're right.
What's the broad picture?
But then
I'm looking for
detailed people like me crazy, because it's like, you would not... I don't like confrontation.
Right. Well,
that was an interesting...
Well, we managed to milk it. Anyways. I wasn't sure we were going to have to maybe
do a different... Because obviously your topic or other heady topics probably didn't get covered unless they did.
No, it didn't. Not at all.
So, not at all. Well, I'm sorry to have diverted into a different context, but I think that we both understand each other a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it was... I don't know that it's revelatory as much as it is clarificatory. There's me being pedantic.
I suppose.
As in, it's nothing new, but it's more of just a sharpening of the... It's more resolution. we've sharpened the details. Rather, it's not like I'm going, oh, I would never have known that. It's more like I kind of knew it, but now I know what the words. Now it's more clearly defined.
I am kind of curious as to the reason why research looks similar between us. If we have kind of a different approach to things, but then...
I still think when you research, you do tend to like jump to the weeds first.
Maybe.
And I'm much more like.
Well,
broad.
like for instance, even in the way we brought up the occult the last time, it was like you were like, I just started looking up. Oh, are these types of things and even the existing or whatever else? Whereas now, like Freemasonry, I'm going to learn everything about it. And all of a sudden,
but this is where it's like another example I would give is in the terms of like I won't start something until I've got the stuff to do it.
See, and I might as well start the project somewhere.
Well, yeah, and there's truth to that, which means
on both sides.
It's like you do have to start somewhere. But I am much more a person who's like, okay, I'm curious about. It's like leatherworking was an example, just as a random one, where it's like I didn't start until I literally got a kit that was like, here's all the stuff you'll need.
Right.
Because then I go, I can do whatever I want now. Here's a better example of because this is a classical learning thing is. Or you might be the kind of person who follows like the tutorial of like, I want to learn how to do this. Make this. This is like a project to learn how to do it. And I'm like, no, teach me the fundamentals and then I'll make what I want. And that's Adam Savage talks about this where you go, that's using.
But I'm inferring. Like, for instance, I'll do that tutorial, but I can learn the basics.
Well, no, but yes, but I find that there's no motivation for me in making something I'm not interested in. If, like, at the end of this project, I have a thing that's useless to me, I'm not going to be motivated to do it. So I would much rather you say, teach me the basics, don't have me make something, just give me all of the info, and then I will use that info to make something I want. So again, I'm saying, teach me the basics, and then I will make. Whereas you would be the kind of person who's like, teach me to make, and that will teach me the basics. And I'm like, no. If it's not something, if I don't end up with a thing I want.
For instance, though, like I'm a theory person first, over and above like learning a song, like hot cross buns. Learning that thing drove me crazy.
Yeah, but you would pick perhaps a song that you like, which is the same process. I agree that it doesn't need to be. Mary Had a Little Lamb, but you would start by going, okay, I want to learn this, so I'm going to learn this.
That's true. I'll probably start with a song and then go, by learning that song, I've now applied a particular principle.
This also is a thing that I struggle with language learning, is I actually feel like I would have learned better in like the 1800s when they were like, here's this big fat grammar textbook, learn it now.
See, I struggle with
Whereas you'd be more like, oh, I'm going to follow the sentence diagrams and like the first grade reading, construct a simple sentence. But I'm like, I would never need to say this sentence. Teach me all of it and then I'll say the sentences I want.
And the thing that I struggle with is because it's so much information, again, then I get lost in the details. Like when I try to do the grammar thing, I'm like, but I don't understand what the neuter and the male and the female.
Language is actually a good one because there's basically two very different schools of thought about it, where there are the people who are like, get conversational first, where it's like, I don't know the grammar and I have a limited vocabulary, but I could, and there's truth to the fact that there's people, it's like, you'll in 6 months, you could actually travel to the country they speak this and get by. Whereas to me, it's like, I'm going to study this for 6 years and then suddenly I'll be fluent. Where it's like, I'll never speak a word to anybody until I'm there, and then people will be like, did you grow up here or something?
No, it's true.
It's very much you're more of the let's go on a linear climb, and I'm like, let's do all the base building, and then suddenly I'll rocket upwards.
Well, what's interesting too is, and this is the last kind of thought experiment that I did actually when I was younger. My mom had me tested on some weird neural thing, and I don't know why.
And I don't know.
But I do know that the doctors found it interesting that when they were doing the particular research on the way my brain works, that they were
what did they do to you?
During the
my parents had me tested when I was young. I never knew why.
It was early in the kind of stages of when they were figuring out that the whole right left brain concept, and so they were trying to determine that. So anyway, they were saying that it was interesting that when I was testing, I would virtually ignore the instructions. Virtually ignore them. Like, it would be, so it's a computerized thing of like, oh, here's how you do what you're supposed to do, and here's the, you know, the way that we solve this, and here's all the, but then when the example would come on, I'd be like, psh, locked into what's going on. They would do the example, and I'm like, okay, I'm done. And then I would just do it.
See, I always hate that. I do hate, and I recognize the necessity for it, but I still dislike it, where it's, even when it's learning, like even if it's something as simple as software, where it's like, I'm trying to learn how to do the thing, it's like, what I want to know is how to, I'm the kind of person that's like, okay, I'm going to try to do the thing that I have in my head.
Yeah.
And then I will look up tutorials when I reach something I can't do.
Can't do, yeah, exactly.
Whereas I'm not just going to go like, oh, here's how to make this. Because I'm like, well, I don't want this, I want that. So I'll come to look for the tutorials once I know what I need. But
Right.
I'm going to try it out first.
Right.
Because then I'll know what I'm missing.
Yeah, no, you're
rather
not.
than just give me all the details. Because I'm like, for all I know, half of this stuff won't matter. I'd rather know this is what I'm trying, so these are the things I need to learn.
No, you're exactly right. My brain does tend to get lost in the weeds a lot more easily, I think, than yours. But again, then the unique thing about that, and I've said this to my wife before too.
I am the kind of person that's like, okay, I'm not going to make any progress for 3 years, and then suddenly it's essentially the false overnight success concept, where it's like, it's never genuinely that. It's like, okay, I've been doing this for 5 years, and then, oh, now I can do it.
Yeah.
Whereas rather than the visible, like, oh, I'm slowly gaining progress, and it looks as though I'm slowly gaining progress.
Right.
To me, it's like, I've been doing this, and no one would ever know because it's not going anywhere. And then suddenly it's like, oh, I get it all now. I've got it.
Yeah, that's true.
And that means that sometimes if you don't stick that out, you never get anywhere. Whereas you could at least stop somewhere in the middle and be like, well, I've got at least this much. Or if I stop in the middle, I'm like, I got nothing still. I've got a bunch of half-finished research.
It's like, yeah, I got a mobile, but it's still useless.
I've got all the parts. It's just not put together. Well, I want to see what the other ones of these things taste like, so...
Stop it there.
So we'll leave it at that.